Donald Trump has questioned the intelligence of his opponents for decades. But by October 2025, Jasmine Crockett decided to flip the script on the man who calls himself a stable genius. She didn't just call him names, she brought something he feared more than any political rival: medical scrutiny. In a formal, multi-page summons addressed to the White House physician, she demanded a full investigation into his mental and physical fitness. It wasn't the kind of partisan bickering that fades in a news cycle. It was a legal strike, documented and delivered to 50 million viewers, asking the one question the president could not answer: are you cognitively capable of holding the nuclear codes? Crockett counted the verbal stumbles, the physical instabilities, and the erratic midnight posts because that is what a civil rights attorney does. She gathers evidence of incompetence. And tonight, at a rally in the heart of Dallas, she brought the receipts of his decline. The president had labeled her a low IQ person 47 times. A badge of honor she now wore like armor. As she stood on the stage, the tension in the room was palpable. The audience, a mix of fearful families and defiant taxpayers, watched as she held up a letter that threatened the very foundation of his authority. The man who had mocked others for their weakness was now the one whose health was being examined like a faulty product under a microscope. The auditorium in Dallas was not just a campaign stop. It was a courtroom where the defendant was absent, but his presence was felt in every nervous glance of the Secret Service and every flicker of the television monitors. Jasmine Crockett stood at the center of the storm, her hand resting on the stack of medical demands like a prosecutor holding a smoking gun. She knew that the man sitting in the White House had spent his entire life building a myth of strength and vitality. And she was here to systematically dismantle that myth with the cold, hard logic of a clinical assessment. The president calls me low IQ because that is what bullies do when they can't handle the math, Crockett stated, her voice projecting to the very back of the room where 50 million digital eyes were watching. He says China pays the tariffs. But the families in this room know better. He says Mexico will pay for the wall. But our federal budget knows better. And now, he says he is a perfect physical specimen. But the White House medical records tell a story of a man whose cognitive grip is slipping while his finger remains on the button. She pulled out a second document, this one detailing the Trump tax of late 2025. While Trump was busy framing his 10% universal tariff as a victory over foreign powers, Crockett had the local data from the Dallas-Fort Worth Metroplex. She spoke of the small business owners in the West End who were seeing their import costs double, and the families in Oak Cliff who were choosing between medicine and a grocery bill that had increased by $135 in just 12 months. This is the reality of his strength, she declared. It is a tax on the poor to pay for the mistakes of a man who can't even remember the details of the bills he's signing. The drama of the evening intensified as she addressed the elephant in the room, the June 2025 airstrikes on Iran. Without a single consultation with the Senate, without a single vote from the House, the president had unilaterally ordered a strike on the Fordow and Natanz facilities. Crockett characterized this not as a strategic maneuver, but as the reckless impulse of a declining mind seeking the ultimate distraction. A president who cannot navigate a domestic budget without lying 47 times is a president who will start a war just to hear the sound of the trumpets. She argued. She linked the global instability directly to the cognitive decline she had officially requested the White House physician to investigate. Trump's reaction, beamed in from a private event in Mar-a-Lago, was a frantic attempt to reclaim the alpha persona he took to Truth Social and the cable news circuits, doubling down on his low IQ rhetoric. He claimed Crockett was a disaster for Texas and that her party was trembling because of his polling numbers. But the more he screamed, the more Crockett smiled. She had already taken his insults and turned them into the backbone of her 2026 Senate campaign. She played a snippet of his voice on the big screens, the audio of him calling her a threat, and then looked the audience in the eye. "He's right," she said. "I am a threat. I am a threat to the fraud. I am a threat to the extraction. I am a threat to a system that picks your pocket and calls it America First." The context of the 2026 Senate race transformed the night from a policy critique into a declaration of political war. Crockett wasn't just defending her House seat, she was taking the fight to the heart of the MAGA fortress in Texas. She attacked the mass deportation plans, calling them a moral bankruptcy that would hollow out the Texas economy and tear at the fabric of every community in the state. She positioned herself as the shield for SNAP benefits and the protector of the Affordable Care Act, programs that the administration was actively trying to gut to cover the deficit created by corporate tax cuts. As the first part of the Dallas rally drew to a close, the energy in the room was not just supportive, it was electric with the sense of a changing tide. Jasmine Crockett had done what no other politician had dared to do. She had made Donald Trump's own health and sanity a central campaign issue. Backed by the authority of a formal investigation request, she had laid the gauntlet down. The man who never paid for his mistakes was finally being presented with a bill that his money couldn't cover, a bill for his fitness, his integrity, and his future. Round one was over, and the receipts were no longer just on the table, they were the foundation of a new American resistance. By October 2025, the shadow of the universal reciprocal tariffs had been eclipsed by an even darker cloud, the midnight hammer. In June, without a single consultation with the Senate or a whisper of congressional authorization, Donald Trump had ordered surgical strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities at Fordow and Natanz. He heralded it as obliteration, a masterstroke of decisive strength. But to Jasmine Crockett, it was the hallmark of a unilateral declaration of war and a flagrant violation of the Constitution. She stood in the House Judiciary Committee, her voice vibrating with a cold, prosecutorial fury, accusing the president of playing God with the lives of service members, to distract from the reality that American families were still paying for his failed trade policies at the grocery store. The drama of the physical and mental fitness investigation was now at the center of the national conversation. Crockett had not just asked for a medical checkup, she had issued a formal summons to White House physician Sean Barbabella, demanding a full accounting of the president's cognitive decline. She pointed to the erratic midnight decrees and the June 2025 medical memorandum that hinted at chronic venous insufficiency and a suspicious reliance on aspirin. A man who cannot navigate the basic requirements of the War Powers Act. She told a swarm of reporters on the Capitol steps, as a man whose finger should not be anywhere near a nuclear button. This isn't about politics, it's about a national security crisis of competence. Trump's response from Mar-a-Lago was a frantic, digital storm of personal insults. He took to Truth Social, labeling Crockett the low IQ star of a Democrat Party in big trouble. He mocked her meticulously counted 47 lies about tariffs and her insistence on medical transparency. She's a very low IQ person. He boomed at a rally in Florida, the crowd roaring as he challenged her and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to take the same cognitive test he had once aced. But Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. In a move that left political consultants in awe, she appeared on Jimmy Kimmel Live and accepted the challenge, mocking the IQ test as a simple dementia screening. If he wants to identify an elephant on national television, she laughed, I'm down, but let's see if he can identify the Constitution while he's at it. As the winter of 2025 set in, the mass deportation initiative, the president's signature immigration crackdown, began to hollow out communities across Texas. Crockett stood at the gates of detention centers, her presence a constant, nagging reminder of the human cost of a policy built on slogans. She apologized on behalf of the government to families torn apart by random kidnappings and ICE terror. She linked the humanitarian crisis directly to the economic extraction, arguing that the administration was starving children and seniors by withholding SNAP and WIC funds to pay for the moral bankruptcy of mass deportations. No president should hold hungry families hostage to play political games, she declared, championing the Keep SNAP and WIC Funded Act of 2025. The boy gun context of the 2026 Senate race transformed her from a congresswoman into a symbol of resistance. In December 2025, Jasmine Crockett officially launched her bid for the U.S. Senate in Texas. Her debut campaign ad was a masterclass in psychological warfare. It featured no music, just the raw audio of Donald Trump's own voice calling her a threat and a low IQ person. Crockett stood silent in the frame, arms crossed, smiling as the president's insults played on a loop. When the audio cut out, the screen flickered with a single message: Crockett for U.S. Senate. She was no longer just running against a Republican incumbent, she was running against the very concept of MAGA in its own heartland. She positioned herself as the fearless alternative, the woman who would walk into the lion's den of Texas politics armed with nothing but the truth and a stack of medical receipts. The 50 million viewers who had seen her dismantle the tariff lie in Phoenix were now watching her dismantle the man himself. Round 2 was coming to a close, and the president was realizing that the low IQ person from Dallas was proving to have a tactical mind far more sophisticated than any lawyer he had ever hired. The bill for his mental fitness, his unconstitutional wars, and his predatory policies was arriving, and this time, the receipt was signed by Jasmine Crockett. The legal indictment of Donald Trump's administration had moved from the abstract ledger of trade deficits to the physical and psychological reality of the man himself. By late 2025, Jasmine Crockett had transformed the political arena into a clinical examination room, forcing the nation to look beyond the spray tan and the bluster toward a documented record of decline. The third stage of the confrontation began in October, when Crockett issued a formal, multi-page summons to White House physician Captain Sean Barbabella. This was not a mere request for transparency, it was a targeted legal strike based on observable data. She highlighted a July 2025 medical memorandum that indicated the president was suffering from chronic venous insufficiency and was being administered daily aspirin, a regimen typically discouraged for men of his age without specific cardiovascular history. She meticulously listed the cognitive lapses and visible swelling that had become undeniable during his public appearances. If the president cannot recall the fundamental tenets of the Constitution he swore to protect, Crockett told the press, standing on the steps of the Capitol, then we don't have a leader, we have a crisis of competence. Trump's reaction was a digital landslide of vitriol. He took to Truth Social, labeling Crockett the low IQ star of the Democratic Party and a radical extremist whose only talent was counting things that don't exist. He mocked her meticulously gathered 47 lies about tariffs and her demand for a cognitive exam. She's a very low IQ person, he boomed at a rally, the familiar insults echoing through the speakers. Maybe she should take the test. I aced it. The doctors said they've never seen anything like it. But she wouldn't know an elephant if it stepped on her Walmart shopping cart. Crockett did not flinch at the low IQ label. She wore it as a badge of tactical superiority. In a move that left political consultants in awe, she launched a campaign advertisement for the 2026 Senate race that used Trump's own voice, harsh, mocking, and aggressive, as the soundtrack for her own highlights, as the president's voice called her a threat and a danger. The screen displayed the legislation she had introduced to protect SNAP and WIC benefits from his administration's attempts to starve the working class. The ad ended with a simple, devastating line: if he's afraid of my IQ, imagine what he's afraid of in the Senate. The confrontation reached a global boiling point over the Midnight Hammer, the June 2025 airstrikes on Iranian nuclear facilities at Fordow and Natanz. Trump heralded the operation as a masterstroke of decisive strength that totally obliterated the Iranian threat. Crockett, however, viewed it through the lens of a former public defender and a constitutional scholar. She characterized the strikes as a unilateral declaration of war and a flagrant violation of the War Powers Act. She stood in the House Judiciary Committee, accusing the president of playing God with the lives of service members to distract from the domestic economic extraction he had presided over. A president who cannot navigate a trade agreement without taxing his own citizens. She argued, as a president who will resort to missiles to maintain the illusion of power. As the winter of 2025 set in, the humanitarian crisis of the mass deportation initiative began to hollow out communities across Texas. Crockett stood at the gates of detention centers, apologizing to families torn apart by random kidnappings performed in the name of security. She linked the cruelty of the deportations directly to the economic negligence of the administration, pointing out that while billions were being spent on manhunting, over 3.5 million Texans were going without their November SNAP benefits because the president was holding hungry families hostage to play political games. She championed the Keep SNAP and WIC-funded Act of 2025, positioning herself as the only shield between the vulnerable and the administration's moral bankruptcy. By December 2025, the Dallas Gauntlet had evolved into a high-stakes bid for the U.S. Senate. When Jasmine Crockett officially filed her paperwork, the political dominoes fell instantly. Former Representative Colin Allred, sensing the overwhelming momentum of the Phoenix effect, abandoned his bid, leaving the path clear for the woman who had turned Trump's insults into her greatest political assets. She was no longer just a congresswoman from Dallas. She was the national face of a resistance that spoke in receipts and medical summons. The man who had mocked others for their weakness for 78 years was now facing a woman who was methodically proving that his own strength was a mirage. And his bill, for the tariffs, the wall, the wars, and his very fitness to lead, was finally coming due in the heart of Texas. The clinical precision of Jasmine Crockett's campaign shifted from medical investigations to the stark reality of survival on the ground. By late 2025, the Trump tax was no longer just a figure on a receipt. It was the catalyst for a humanitarian crisis that stretched from the grocery aisles of Dallas to the detention centers on the border. The fourth round of the confrontation centered on the administration's mass deportation initiative, a logistical juggernaut that Crockett characterized as a war on the American working class. While the president boasted of 400,000 deportations by September, Crockett stood at the gates of ICE facilities, documenting the human and economic fallout. She didn't just cite constitutional violations, she cited the $315 billion taxpayer cost of a decade-long deportation campaign, a figure that dwarfed even the most optimistic revenue from his tariffs. She argued that the administration was effectively paying for manhunting with the money it was extracting from families at the supermarket. You are taking from the hands of mothers to fund the shackling of their neighbors, she challenged, her words resonating in the 30% of Texas households that identified as mixed status. This humanitarian battle transitioned into a fight for the most basic of needs, food. In November 2025, the administration made a calculated decision to withhold already approved funding for the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP, and the Special Supplemental Nutrition Program for Women, Infants, and Children, WIC. Over 3.5 million Texans and 42 million Americans found themselves in a state of sudden, artificial starvation. Crockett's response was immediate and legislative. She co-introduced the Keep SNAP and WIC-funded Act of 2025, a direct rebuke to the president's attempt to hold hungry families hostage. She stood in the well of the House, pointing out the irony of a president who claimed to protect American greatness while allowing senior citizens to ration their groceries because their benefits were being used as political leverage. "This is not policy, it is negligence," she declared. "It is the moral bankruptcy of a man who thinks strength is found in a hollow stomach." The drama of the domestic crisis was set against the backdrop of global escalation. The 12-day war. In June, the unilateral airstrikes on Iran's nuclear facilities at Fordow and Natanz had not totally obliterated the threat as Trump claimed. Instead, it had triggered a crumbling nuclear order, driving America into a security posture that demanded even more public funding. Crockett linked the global instability directly to the domestic suffering. She argued that the president was signing death warrants abroad and hunger warrants at home, all to maintain the illusion of a man in control. She used the strikes to further justify her demand for the cognitive investigation, suggesting that the midnight hammer was the impulsive act of a declining mind seeking the ultimate distraction from a failing economy. The context of the Senate race reached its final, irrevocable stage in December 2025. On December 8, Crockett officially launched her bid to unseat Republican Senator John Cornyn, declaring herself the fearless alternative to a GOP that refused to stand up to the president's extraction. Her announcement was a masterclass in political theater. She played a video montage of Trump's low IQ insults, her face lit by the flickering screen as she smiled through the vitriol. When the audio cut out, she spoke to the 50 million viewers who had followed her since Phoenix. "He calls me a threat because I can count. He calls me a danger because I have the receipts. And he's right. I am a threat to every lie he has told you for 78 years." By the time the Dallas rally ended, the Phoenix effect had become a national movement. Crockett was no longer just a congresswoman, she was the face of a resistance that refused to be bullied into silence. She had turned the president's mass deportations into an economic indictment, his withholding of food benefits into a moral crusade, and his low IQ insults into the fuel for a Senate run that promised to be the most expensive and consequential in Texas history. The man who had spent a lifetime making others pay was now facing a woman who was methodically closing every loophole. And for the first time, the president found that his insults weren't just failing, they were being used to pay for the campaign that would eventually bring him to justice. The battle had moved past the abstract ledger of trade deficits and entered the dangerous territory of medical fitness and constitutional authority. By December 2025, Jasmine Crockett was no longer just counting lies, she was issuing subpoenas to the president's own reality. The fifth stage of the confrontation began on October 13, 2025, when Crockett issued a formal, explosive letter to White House physician Captain Sean Barbabella. This wasn't the standard partisan bickering the public had grown accustomed to, it was a targeted legal strike. She demanded a full accounting of the president's observable cognitive lapses and visible physical anomalies, specifically pointing to a July 2025 medical memorandum that indicated Trump was suffering from chronic venous insufficiency and a suspicious reliance on daily aspirin, a regimen usually discouraged for men his age without specific cardiovascular justifications. Standing on the steps of the Capitol, she spoke to 50 million digital eyes. "If the man behind the resolute desk cannot recall the basic tenets of the Constitution he swore to protect, then we don't have a leader, we have a national security crisis of competence." Trump's reaction was a digital landslide of vitriol. He took to the airwaves, labeling Crockett the low IQ star of the Democratic Party and a radical extremist whose only talent was counting things that don't exist. He mocked her meticulously gathered 47 lies about tariffs and her demand for a cognitive exam. "She's a very low IQ person," he boomed at a rally in Florida, the familiar insults echoing through the speakers. "Maybe she should take the test. I aced it. The doctors said they've never seen anything like it. But she wouldn't know an elephant if it stepped on her Walmart shopping cart." Crockett did not flinch at the low IQ label, she treated it like a piece of kinetic energy, catching it and hurling it back with twice the force. On December 8, 2025, she officially launched her bid for the U.S. Senate in Texas with a campaign advertisement that left the political establishment in awe. The video featured no music, just the raw audio of Trump's own voice, his harsh, mocking, and aggressive tones calling her a threat and a danger. Crockett stood silent in the frame, arms crossed, smiling as the president's insults played on a loop. When the audio cut out, she delivered the final blow. If he's afraid of my IQ, imagine what he's afraid of in the Senate. The drama shifted to the theater of war. In June 2025, the administration had bypassed Congress to order surgical strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities at Fordow and Natanz. Trump heralded the 12-day war as a masterstroke of decisive strength, claiming he had totally obliterated the threat. Crockett, however, characterized the strikes as a unilateral declaration of war and a flagrant violation of the War Powers Act. She stood in the House Judiciary Committee, accusing the president of playing God with the lives of service members to distract from the reality that American families were still paying for his failed trade policies at the grocery store. A president who cannot navigate a domestic budget without lying 47 LAN. She argued, as a president who will resort to missiles to maintain the illusion of power. As the winter of 2025 set in, the humanitarian crisis of the mass deportation initiative, a project costing taxpayers an estimated $315 billion over a decade, began to hollow out communities across Texas. Crockett stood at the gates of detention centers, apologizing to families torn apart by random kidnappings and ICE terror. She linked the cruelty of the deportations directly to the economic negligence of the administration, pointing out that while billions were being spent on manhunting, over 3.5 million Texans were going without their November SNAP and WIC benefits. The administration had deliberately withheld already approved funding, a move Crockett slammed as holding hungry families hostage to play political games. She championed the Keep SNAP and WIC Funded Act of 2025, positioning herself as the only shield between the vulnerable and the administration's moral bankruptcy. By the time her Dallas rally ended, the Phoenix Effect had become an unstoppable national movement. Crockett was no longer just a congresswoman from Dallas, she was the front-runner for the U.S. Senate. Having cleared the path after former Representative Colin Allred withdrew from the race, she had turned the president's insults into her marketing and his policies into her indictments. The man who had mocked others for their weakness for 78 years was now facing a woman who was methodically proving that his own strength was a mirage. Round 5 was coming to a close, and the president was realizing that in Jasmine Crockett, he hadn't just found an opponent, he had found his reckoning in the heart of Texas. The legal indictment of Donald Trump's administration had moved from the abstract ledger of trade deficits to the physical and psychological reality of the man himself. By late 2025, Jasmine Crockett had transformed the political arena into a clinical examination room, forcing the nation to look beyond the spray tan and the bluster toward a documented record of decline. The sixth stage of the confrontation reached a fever pitch in December 2025. When the low IQ narrative was weaponized as a campaign asset. On December 8, standing in the heart of Dallas at the Frederick Douglass Human Services and Justice Center, Crockett officially launched her bid for the U.S. Senate. Her entrance was preceded by a campaign advertisement that was a masterclass in psychological warfare. The video featured no music, just the raw, grating audio of Donald Trump's own voice, his harsh, mocking, and aggressive tones calling her a threat, a danger, and a very low IQ person. Crockett stood silent in the frame, arms crossed, smiling as the president's insults played on a loop. When the audio cut out, she spoke to the 50 million viewers who had followed her since Phoenix. He calls me a threat because I can count. He calls me a danger because I have the receipts. And he's right. I am a threat to every lie he has told you for 78 years. Trump's reaction from Air Force One was instantaneous. As he departed for Pennsylvania, he told reporters that Crockett's Senate run was a gift to Republicans, doubling down on his rhetoric by stating, "She's a low IQ person. I can't imagine she wins. I can't even believe she's a politician." Actually, he framed her candidacy as an act of desperation by the Democratic Party, unaware that his predictable insults were being used as the primary fuel for her record-shattering fundraising. Crockett countered by pointing out the irony. For a man who is supposed to be running the whole country, you sure do have my name in your mouth a lot. Every time you say my name, you're reminding the world that you're terrified of smart, bold black women telling the truth. The drama shifted from the campaign trail to the theater of war. The fallout from the June 2025 airstrikes on Iranian nuclear facilities, the Midnight Hammer, had split the nation's psyche. While a Reagan Institute poll suggested 60% of the public approved of the decisive strength, CNN polls showed a massive disapproval rating among independents and families who saw the strikes as a unilateral declaration of war that bypassed congressional authority. Crockett used this rift to hammer home her medical investigation. She argued that the impulsive nature of the strikes, combined with Trump's inability to articulate basic constitutional responsibilities, was direct evidence of the cognitive decline she had officially asked the White House physician to investigate. The humanitarian crisis of the mass deportation initiative and the withholding of SNAP and WIC benefits became the emotional core of her Senate bid. Crockett stood at the gates of detention centers, apologizing to families torn apart by manhunting, while the president touted the strikes as a spectacular success. She linked the two directly, arguing that the administration was signing death warrants abroad and hunger warrants at home to maintain the illusion of control. By the time her Dallas rally ended, she had cleared the political field. Former Representative Colin Allred had stepped aside, recognizing that the Phoenix effect had evolved into a Dallas gauntlet. The woman who Trump called low IQ had outmaneuvered him at every tactical turn, turning his own insults into the stairs of her ascent to the Senate. Round sow was over, and the president was realizing that in Jasmine Crockett, he hadn't just found an opponent, he had found the person who was methodically closing every loophole of his 78-year-old con. The final convergence of the Dallas gauntlet had arrived, and the air inside the Frederick Douglass Center was thick with the scent of an impending political storm. By mid-December 2025, Jasmine Crockett was no longer just a congresswoman, she had become the definitive high-velocity challenger to the entire MAGA structure. The seventh stage of this confrontation was not about evidence or medical reports, it was about the transfer of power. The morning of December 8, 2025, began with a political earthquake. Colin Allred, the former NFL star and the leading Democratic contender for the Senate, officially withdrew from the race, sensing the undeniable momentum of the Phoenix effect, and wishing to avoid a bruising primary that would only serve Trump's interests. Allred stepped aside. Within hours, Crockett filed her paperwork, transforming the Texas Senate race from a standard primary into a national crusade. Her debut campaign advertisement was a masterclass in psychological subversion. It featured no soaring oratory or patriotic music. Instead, it opened with the raw, grating audio of Donald Trump's own voice. Their new star, Crockett. Trump's voice rasped over the speakers. "She's a very low IQ person. I can't imagine she wins. I think it's a gift to Republicans." Crockett stood in the center of the frame, silent, smiling with the calm of a predator who had already set the trap. When the audio cut out, she delivered the killing blow. "He calls me a gift because he's terrified of the bill I'm bringing to the Senate. I'm Jasmine Crockett, and I'm coming for you." Trump's response, delivered from the steps of Air Force One in Pennsylvania, was a frantic attempt to reestablish dominance. He told reporters that Crockett was a terrible representative and a radical, whom he couldn't believe was even a politician. But the insults no longer held their sting. They had been priced into her brand. For every time he called her low IQ, her fundraising numbers surged. By the end of the day, she had raised millions in small dollar donations, many totaling exactly $47, a digital echo of the 47 lies she had meticulously documented about his tariffs. The drama shifted to the Senate floor, where the president's Republican bootlickers, as Allred had called them, were forced to defend a budget that was bleeding billions. Crockett linked the $46 billion in diverted wall funds and the $156 billion annual tariff extraction directly to the Midnight Hammer airstrikes in Iran. She argued that the president was using the theater of war to mask the cognitive and financial decline of his administration. She wasn't just running against incumbent John Cornyn. She was running against a system that allowed a man to bypass Congress to start wars while American seniors were being denied their SNAP benefits. As the rally in Dallas reached its crescendo, Crockett held up one last receipt, not from Walmart, but a symbolic Bill of Rights she claimed the president had attempted to void. "You can call me every name in the book," she shouted over the roar of a crowd that had grown to include thousands standing in the biting December wind outside. "You can mock my IQ. You can lie about who pays the bills. And you can try to hide behind your lawyers. But in Texas, we don't declare bankruptcy on the truth. We don't settle for 80 cents on the dollar. We demand the full payment." The silence that had defined the end of the Phoenix town hall had been replaced by a deafening roar in Dallas. Jasmine Crockett had done what 78 years of lawsuits and political cycles had failed to do. She had made the con impossible to ignore. The low IQ woman from Dallas had outcalculated the stable genius from Mar-a-Lago. And as she walked off the stage to the sound of "The bill stops here," the 50 million viewers at home knew the final round had just begun. The man who never paid for his mistakes was finally facing a woman who was methodically closing every exit. And the most consequential Senate race in American history was now a fight for the very sanity of the republic.